Margaret Whittaker was not born into comfort. She came into the world in a small rural town outside Lubbock, Texas, the kind of place where the land stretched flat for miles and neighbors measured worth not by books or ambitions, but by the size of their herds and the yield of their cotton fields. Her family was large, poor, and rooted in tradition. Girls were expected to marry early, raise children, and keep to domestic duties. But even as a young girl, Margaret's gaze was set far beyond the dust-filled roads of her hometown. She spent evenings under a single lamp, devouring textbooks that her teachers let her borrow, repeating to herself the vow that she would not be trapped in the same cycle. When she graduated high school, her parents urged her to marry a local boy who owned some acreage. Margaret refused. With a scholarship and sheer determination, she enrolled at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, majoring in accounting. The move was scandalous by the standards of her small community. Too proud for her raising, the whispers followed her, but Margaret ignored them. She rode an old Greyhound bus into the city with a single suitcase and the stubborn belief that knowledge could be her escape. College was grueling. Margaret juggled classes with part-time work at a diner, balancing ledgers for small businesses in exchange for a few extra dollars. She had no time for sorority events or weekend parties. Her classmates often pitted her austere life, but Margaret didn't see it as deprivation. To her, every number she entered into a balance sheet was a step away from poverty, a step closer to independence. By the time she was in her late 20s, she had passed her CPA exams, built a reputation for precision and discipline, and finally signed the lease on a small apartment in Houston. For the first time in her life, she turned the key to a home that was hers alone. It was during this time that she met Tyler Brooks. He was a taxi driver who picked her up one rainy evening outside her office. He was younger, charming in a rough-edged way, with quick jokes and an easy smile. Margaret, who had spent years burying herself in ledgers and responsibilities, found his attention intoxicating. He told her she was beautiful, that she worked too hard, that she deserved someone to make her laugh. For the first time in years, Margaret let her guard down. She allowed herself late-night conversations, long drives where Tyler would deliberately take the scenic route just to keep her in the car longer. At first, their romance seemed like a gift life had withheld until then. Tyler moved into her apartment within months, cooking her meals, making her laugh, filling her once silent home with energy. Margaret thought she had found not just a partner, but a family she had longed for. But as time wore on, cracks appeared. Tyler complained about the dangers of night driving, about rude customers, about how the work wasn't worthy of him. He quit driving altogether, promising he'd find something better. Weeks turned into months, and soon Margaret was the only one paying bills. Tyler started disappearing for days at a time under the pretense of odd jobs. She wanted to believe him, but the truth unfolded brutally one evening when, returning from a business dinner, she spotted him in a restaurant across town, holding hands with a younger woman, kissing her knuckles as though Margaret had never existed. The betrayal hit like a physical blow. When she confronted him, Tyler's mask fell. He sneered that she was too old, too cold, too serious, that no man in his right mind would want a woman like her. The words carved deep scars. Margaret ended the relationship, but not before her faith in love was shattered. For years afterward, she threw herself entirely into work, vowing never again to be fooled. And then came Richard Whittaker. Unlike Tyler, Richard was everything steady and respectable. He was the director of a partner firm that collaborated with her accounting company. From the start, his attention was different, measured, respectful, warm without being manipulative. He invited her to formal dinners, brought her thoughtful gifts, and looked at her as though she was the only woman in the room. Margaret, cautious after her wounds, resisted at first, but Richard's consistency wore down her walls. He wasn't after her savings or her apartment. He was established, confident, and deeply kind. Their wedding was small but elegant, held in a modest chapel in Houston. For the first time in her life, Margaret allowed herself to exhale. Richard's home became her sanctuary. The nights of loneliness and suspicion gave way to quiet conversations and shared plans. She was in her early 40s when she realized she was pregnant. The news stunned her. After years of believing motherhood might never come, here it was, a miracle. Richard was overjoyed. He insisted the child would be a boy, and he already had a name picked out, Andrew. But life, so generous for a fleeting moment, turned cruel. Before Margaret reached her third trimester, Richard collapsed at his office. A massive stroke claimed him at only 45. Margaret's world disintegrated overnight. The man who had restored her faith in family, who had promised her a safe harbor, was gone. She buried him under a gray Texas sky, clutching her still-growing belly as if it were the last tether holding her to hope. Alone, grieving, and terrified, Margaret could have broken. But she did not. Instead, she redirected every ounce of her love, her discipline, her ambition into the unborn child. Andrew would be her purpose, her redemption, her legacy. From the day he was born, fragile, premature, fighting for each breath, Margaret knew her life was no longer her own. Every decision, every sacrifice would be for him. The scars from Tyler's betrayal and the void Richard's death had left behind hardened her resolve. No one, nothing, would ever take Andrew's future from him. And so began the story of a woman who gave up everything for her son, a woman whose pride and fears would one day collide with the very happiness she had sworn to protect. Andrew Whitaker entered the world too soon. Barely 5 pounds, his body was fragile, his lungs underdeveloped, his cries weak and uneven. Doctors at a Houston hospital warned Margaret to prepare for complications. They spoke of the risks with measured tones, chronic illness, developmental delays, even the possibility that he might not survive infancy. But where others saw statistics, Margaret saw a mission. She moved into a rhythm of sleepless nights by Andrew's crib, listening for every irregular breath. Houston clinics became her second home. She drove him across the city for checkups, waiting in crowded lobbies with a folder full of medical records tucked under her arm. When one doctor shrugged and offered only medication, she searched for another. She pressed for answers, read every pamphlet, and called insurance hotlines until she found programs that would cover therapies most families never knew existed. If there was a specialist who might help, Margaret found a way to get Andrew into the appointment. Rehabilitation programs consumed her evenings. She learned stretches and exercises from physical therapists, repeating them at home until her son's tiny muscles grew stronger. While other mothers in her neighborhood hosted playdates or shopped leisurely, Margaret sat on the floor with Andrew, coaxing him to lift his head, to crawl, to walk. Each milestone felt like a private victory over fate. When Andrew turned 5 and sprinted across the yard, Margaret wept, remembering the nights she had begged God simply to let him live. But Margaret was not only his nurse, she was also his provider. She kept her position as a senior accountant in Houston, balancing ledgers by day and mothering by night. Co-workers admired her discipline, though few knew how much she carried. While they shared stories of vacations or evenings at wine bars, Margaret slipped out at exactly 5 o'clock, racing to pick Andrew up from after-school care, determined never to let him feel neglected. Her own pleasures faded into the background. No dating, no hobbies, no ligeiring dinners. Everything revolved around Andrew, and Andrew flourished under her relentless care. By grade school, his health stabilized. He discovered the piano in his elementary music room, his small fingers hesitant at first, but quickly nimble. Margaret saved for a second-hand upright piano, wedged into their modest Houston apartment, and sat proudly as he stumbled through scales. Soon, melodies filled their evenings, the strains of Beethoven and Chopin echoing through the narrow halls. Swimming came next. Margaret enrolled him in lessons at the community pool, hoping the exercise would strengthen his lungs. Andrew did more than strengthen, he excelled. By middle school, medals dangled from his bedroom wall, each one a reminder of battles once fought in hospital rooms. His coaches admired his persistence, but Margaret knew where it came from. Survival had been his first training ground. Then came computers. While other children wasted hours on video games, Andrew pulled apart old desktops from yard sales, fascinated by circuits and wires. Margaret, though she barely understood the jargon, recognized his passion. She bought him his first real computer, an expensive investment that forced her to skip new clothes for herself and settle for instant dinners for months. Andrew repaid her faith with brilliance. By high school, he was winning statewide programming competitions, building websites for local businesses, and dreaming of Silicon Valley. Through it all, Margaret's pride was fierce, but so was her vigilance. She attended every recital, every swim meet, every awards ceremony. She applauded the loudest, clutched every certificate as if it were a trophy for herself too. In her mind, each achievement was not only Andrew's triumph, but proof that her sacrifices had meaning. Their relationship was close, sometimes suffocatingly so. Margaret hovered, asking about his friends, his homework, his goals. Andrew, respectful and dutiful, rarely pushed back. He understood how much she had given, how deeply she loved him. Their apartment was filled with warmth, but also with Margaret's unspoken belief. Andrew was her life's work. He would succeed because she would not allow anything less. When college applications arrived, Andrew's acceptance letters piled up quickly. Offers came from universities across the country, some with scholarships, others with promises of research positions. Margaret pressed for schools in Texas, unwilling to see her son drift too far. Andrew agreed. He had no desire to rebel against the woman who had built his entire world. He chose the University of Houston's prestigious technology program, a decision that thrilled his professors and reassured his mother. Margaret beamed at his orientation, her eyes glistening as she watched him walk among students with laptops and ambition. She remembered the frail infant who once struggled for breath, and now here he was tall, strong, confident, stepping into a future that once seemed impossible. Andrew's early semesters were a string of triumphs. Straight A's, invitations to research projects, and more programming awards. His professors praised his discipline, his classmates admired his skills, and Margaret, attending every open house, every student showcase, felt as though her life had reached its pinnacle. She told friends and old coworkers that Andrew was destined for greatness, that he would one day lead a major firm or build the next great technology empire. In every word, in every proud smile, Margaret carried not only hope but certainty. Andrew was proof that her sacrifices were justified, her struggles redeemed. She had taken a premature baby who might never walk and raised him into a young man poised for success. To her, there was no higher calling. Andrew was not just her son, he was her reason for being, the legacy she would leave behind. For much of his college career, Andrew Whitaker seemed unstoppable. Professors praised his brilliance, classmates admired his discipline, and Margaret looked on with glowing pride. But by his senior year, cracks began to show, small at first, then widening into chasms. It started innocently enough. A new circle of friends, louder and freer than the diligent group he had once studied with. They celebrated every midterm, every minor victory, with nights out in Houston's sprawling bars. Margaret noticed the changes when Andrew came home for Sunday dinners. His eyes looked tired, his shirt smelled faintly of smoke and alcohol, his laughter a little too forced. She asked, and he brushed it off. "Mom, I'm just unwinding." Everyone does it. But the parties grew wilder. Weekends blurred into weekdays. Margaret would call and get no answer, then receive a text hours later, busy. Don't worry. She worried anyway. The real unraveling came with drugs. At first, it was whispered rumors from neighbors. Someone had seen Andrew outside a club known for cocaine use. Margaret dismissed it, refusing to believe her son could be so reckless. Then she found the evidence herself. A small bag tucked into the pocket of his jeans while doing laundry during one of his rare visits home. Her stomach dropped, her mind spinning with dread. When she confronted him, Andrew's response was not contrition, but anger. "You went through my things? I'm not a kid anymore." His voice was sharper than she had ever heard, his eyes wild with a mixture of shame and defiance. For the first time, Margaret felt a distance between them that terrified her. The tension only escalated. Bills began to disappear from her wallet. Then jewelry, pieces Richard had once given her, vanished. She confronted Andrew again, this time with evidence. He didn't deny it. Instead, he shouted that he needed money, that it wasn't a big deal. Margaret, trembling with disbelief, demanded he stop. That night, the fight reached its peak. Margaret stood in the kitchen, holding the empty jewelry box in her hands, tears streaking her face. Andrew towered over her, his fists clenched, his body trembling with rage. For a brief, horrifying second, Margaret thought her son might strike her. The boy she had carried through hospitals and sleepless nights, the child she had nursed back to health, now stood before her like a stranger. Andrew caught himself before the blow ever landed, but the silence that followed was worse than violence. Margaret's heart broke in that instant. Days later, Andrew was gone. His phone disconnected, his apartment abandoned. Margaret filed a missing persons report, called every friend she knew of, even drove through the rougher parts of Houston searching for him. Nights blurred into mornings as she sat by the window, praying for headlights in the driveway. 3 days passed before she heard what happened. Andrew had been found unconscious at a bus station, his body convulsing from an overdose. He had been left there by so-called friends who didn't want the trouble of calling 911. It was a stranger, a young woman waiting for her bus, who knelt beside him, dialed the number, and refused to leave his side until the ambulance arrived. Margaret never learned the girl's name. She only knew that some unknown angel had saved her son when he was seconds from slipping away. The hospital called her after Andrew was stabilized, but by the time Margaret arrived, he had already checked himself out. She saw only the ghost of what had happened. Paperwork unsigned, nurses speaking of seizures, and a doctor shaking his head at the recklessness of youth. Margaret, frantic, demanded answers, but Andrew had vanished once again, leaving her with more questions than relief. And then, slowly he returned, not in phone calls or apologies, but in behavior. Within weeks, Andrew reappeared at her door, gaunt but sober, speaking of recommitting to school to his future. He didn't explain the lost days. He didn't confess the overdose. He said only that he was done with the nonsense. Margaret dared not probe too deeply, afraid that pressure might drive him away again. She accepted his words, even as shadows lingered behind his eyes. To her, what mattered was that Andrew was back. He attended classes, cleaned himself up, and poured his energy into finishing his degree. Professors, though cautious, praised his renewed discipline. His name once again appeared on honor lists, and his projects began winning accolades. For Margaret, it felt like a miracle. She told herself that Andrew had simply gone through a rebellious phase, that all young men made mistakes before maturing. She tucked away the painful memories of missing jewelry, the terrifying moment in the kitchen, the nights spent searching for him in dark neighborhoods. In her narrative, Andrew had stumbled but risen stronger, an example of resilience, proof that her sacrifices still bore fruit. What she never knew was the truth, that her son's survival had hinged not on willpower alone, but on the intervention of a stranger named Emily Carter, a girl she had yet to meet who had already saved Andrew's life. When Andrew Whitaker finally walked across the stage at the University of Houston, diploma in hand, Margaret thought she might burst with pride. Against every prediction from his frail beginnings, despite every shadow that had threatened to pull him under, her son had not only survived, he had triumphed. honors cords draped across his gown. Professors shook his hand warmly, and his name was read with distinction. Margaret clapped until her palms ached, tears streaking her cheeks, unashamed of the emotion spilling out of her. The job offers followed almost immediately. Andrew's skills in programming and systems design caught the attention of several major firms. When he accepted a position at a Houston-based oilfield services company, Margaret declared to everyone she knew that her son was destined for greatness. In Texas, nothing spoke of prestige and prosperity quite like oil. Andrew threw himself into the work. His supervisors noticed his relentless focus, his quick problem-solving, his ability to lead a team without arrogance. Within 2 years, he was promoted to project manager, supervising men a decade older than him. Industry journals began citing his contributions to new software models used in drilling operations. Margaret collected every clipping, tucking them into a binder like a sacred family album. Every holiday, every neighborhood gathering, Margaret showcased her son. She told stories of his brilliance at church luncheons, boasted of his promotions to former colleagues, and even shared printouts of his awards with distant cousins. To her, Andrew was living proof that sacrifice and devotion bore fruit. But beneath her pride was curiosity, a gnawing question she could never quite answer. When would Andrew settle down? He was handsome, successful, and still young. Other mothers at church compared notes about daughters meeting men like Andrew. Margaret brushed them off with polite smiles, but the silence at her own dinner table reminded her of what was missing. Whenever she raised the subject, Andrew sidestepped. He would smile faintly and say, "I'm busy, Mom. The company has me tied up." Or, "Not yet. There's time for that later." Margaret's suspicion grew with each evasive answer. She wondered if perhaps his years of struggle had scarred him against intimacy. Or worse, that he was keeping secrets from her. Margaret's instincts sharpened with worry. She had given up everything for this boy, guided him through illness, rebellion, and near destruction. Now that he was standing on firm ground, she wanted to see the rest of his life secure. A wife, children, the legacy of the Whitaker name. Her questions became more pointed. Was there anyone he liked? A colleague, perhaps? But Andrew, though affectionate with his mother, kept the doors of his private life firmly closed. The call came on an ordinary Thursday evening. Margaret was folding laundry when her phone buzzed. Andrew's voice carried a calm she hadn't heard before. "Mom," he said, "I'm bringing someone over this weekend." "For dinner?" Margaret froze, a towel still clutched in her hands. For a moment, she thought she'd misheard. "Someone?" she asked carefully. "Yes," Andrew said. "Her name is Emily. I want you to meet her." Her heart leapt and stuttered all at once. After years of silence, here it was, the revelation she had longed for. Yet along with relief came tension. Who was this woman Andrew had chosen to reveal now, after guarding his heart so closely? Why now? She tried to keep her voice steady. "That's wonderful, Andrew. I'll make dinner." When the call ended, Margaret stood in her quiet kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a notebook. If her son was finally introducing a woman, the occasion demanded perfection. The following days became a flurry of preparation. Margaret scoured her favorite market for the freshest produce, drove across town for a cut of prime rib, and polished her grandmother's china that hadn't seen light in years. She ironed table linens until they lay smooth as glass. In her mind, this dinner was not just a family meal. It was an interview, an audition. Whoever Emily was, she would see the Whitaker home at its finest. Margaret rehearsed conversations in her head. Polite questions, subtle probing, the kind of inquiries that could reveal background, upbringing, ambition. She wanted to know if Emily could possibly match the life she had envisioned for her son. By Saturday evening, the table was set, candles waiting to be lit, the air filled with the aroma of roasting beef and rosemary. Margaret adjusted her dress in the hallway mirror, smoothing imaginary wrinkles, rehearsing a smile that looked welcoming but discerning. When headlights finally swept across the driveway, Margaret's chest tightened. She heard Andrew's familiar footsteps on the porch, and then another pair, lighter, hesitant. The doorbell rang. Margaret took a deep breath, steadied her hands, and opened the door. Margaret's carefully arranged dining room glowed with candlelight. The china sparkled, the prime rib rested in the oven, and every glass stood polished to a crystal shine. She had prepared for this evening with the meticulous precision she reserved for balance sheets, determined that nothing, absolutely nothing, would reflect poorly on the Whittaker name. When the door opened and Andrew stepped inside, Margaret's smile came easily. But as her eyes moved to the young woman beside him, her heart sank. Emily Carter was polite, almost shy, as she shook Margaret's hand. She wore a simple dress, navy cotton with faint wear at the seams, and shoes that had clearly seen better days. Her hair was neat, her face unadorned by makeup, and though she carried herself with quiet dignity, Margaret could not ignore the absence of refinement she had expected. She had imagined a polished professional, perhaps a lawyer or an executive. Instead, before her stood a girl who looked as though she had just finished a shift at the hospital. Margaret kept her voice warm. "Welcome, Emily. We're so glad to have you here." Emily smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Whittaker. I've heard so much about you." The title Mrs. Whittaker stirred Margaret's pride, but also reminded her of Richard, of the family legacy she still guarded like treasure. She ushered them inside, seating Emily across from her at the perfectly arranged table. Andrew, oblivious to the silent judgments in his mother's eyes, seemed relaxed, even happy. Dinner began with pleasantries. Margaret asked about Emily's background, her work, her family. Emily answered with honesty, her Oklahoma drawl soft but steady. She spoke of growing up in a small town, the oldest of 5 siblings. When her father left, she had taken on responsibilities far beyond her years, working part-time through high school to help her mother keep the lights on, studying late into the night to earn scholarships. "I'm a nurse now," Emily explained, folding her hands politely in her lap. "I started in pediatrics, but I'm training for the ER. It's demanding, but I love it, and I send money home when I can. My youngest brother just started high school. He wants to go to college too." Her words carried no shame, only quiet pride and sacrifice. Yet Margaret heard something else entirely. A young woman with too many obligations, a family that would always drain her resources. She imagined Andrew's hard-earned salary slipping away, funneled into someone else's household. Margaret's smile never wavered, but her thoughts darkened. She's using him. She must be. Girls like this don't land men like Andrew unless they have an angle. Andrew, sensing nothing, beamed at his mother. "Emily's incredible, Mom. She's the kindest person I know, and she understands me in ways nobody else ever has." The declaration startled Margaret. He spoke with a conviction that unsettled her, a certainty she hadn't heard even in his career decisions. She tightened her grip on her wine glass, willing herself not to show her discomfort. Emily, too, looked at Andrew with quiet affection. "We've been together for a while," she admitted. "I didn't want to intrude on family before I was sure. But Andrew insisted it was time you and I met." Margaret nodded slowly, as though considering. "It's good to meet the people who are important to my son." The words were pleasant enough, but her tone carried an undercurrent of scrutiny. As the meal continued, Emily shared more of her story. How she had worked double shifts to afford nursing school. How she had bought her textbooks secondhand and taken buses across town to classes. How she had often studied by candlelight when the power was cut off at home. Each story revealed resilience, determination, and strength. To Andrew, these were qualities that deepened his love. To Margaret, they sounded like red flags, proof that Emily came from hardship, from scarcity. In Margaret's mind, women from such backgrounds married upward to escape, not out of love. She pictured her son as a target, his career and prospects gleaming like bait. She's clever, Margaret thought, wrapping her struggles in a pretty package of sacrifice. And Andrew, with his soft heart, will fall right into it. Still, she played her role. She complimented Emily's courage, her dedication, her work ethic. She offered second helpings, laughed lightly at Andrew's jokes, and even shared a few stories of his childhood. But inside, suspicion coiled tighter with every passing minute. At the end of the evening, as Andrew and Emily prepared to leave, Andrew placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "Mom," he said, his voice steady and proud. "This is the woman I'm going to marry." Margaret's heart lurched. The words were too definitive, too final. She forced a smile, kissed Andrew's cheek, and embraced Emily with the barest brush of her arms. "Congratulations," she whispered. But when the door closed behind them and the house grew silent, Margaret's mask fell away. She stood in the dim hallway, her fists clenched. In her eyes, Andrew was walking blindly into a trap, and Margaret, who had built his life brick by brick, was not about to watch it crumble at the hands of a girl from Oklahoma. The wedding was not what Margaret Whittaker had envisioned for her only son. She had imagined chandeliers, a ballroom, a string quartet playing as guests in evening gowns toasted with champagne. Instead, Andrew and Emily exchanged vows in a modest chapel on the edge of Houston, with fewer than 50 guests in attendance. The reception was held in a rented banquet hall, decorated with paper lanterns and simple flower arrangements that Emily's friends had arranged themselves. Andrew looked radiant, his hand never leaving Emily's, his smile genuine and unshakable. Margaret clapped, hugged, and smiled where appropriate, but inside her disappointment festered. This was not the society wedding she had expected for the heir of Richard Whittaker's name. To her, it was small, plain, unworthy. After the wedding, Andrew slipped further from her grasp. Invitations to Sunday dinners grew infrequent, phone calls shorter, visits rare. When he did bring Emily to the Whittaker home, the evenings were strained. Margaret asked polite questions laced with subtle critiques about Emily's choice of attire, her plain shoes, her lack of polish. "Such a pretty girl," she would remark with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You'd look lovely with a little more makeup." Or, "I suppose not everyone cares for formal dining, but I do hope Andrew is still eating well at home." Andrew noticed, and his responses grew sharper. "Mom, please," he warned more than once. Emily tried to deflect, responding with soft courtesy, but Margaret could see the discomfort behind her eyes. Every visit ended with Andrew ushering his wife out quickly, and every time, Margaret felt him slipping further away. It was during one of her errands at Houston General, where she went for a routine checkup, that Margaret's suspicions took a darker turn. She turned a corner in the hospital lobby and froze. There was Emily in her nurse's scrubs, standing close to a tall man in a white coat. He was a doctor, handsome and confident, and Emily laughed at something he said, her hand brushing his arm lightly as she leaned in. The sight seared into Margaret's mind. To her, it was confirmation. Emily wasn't just a small-town girl with ambitions. She was unfaithful, reckless enough to flirt openly at her workplace. Margaret retreated before they saw her, her pulse racing with a mixture of fury and vindication. "I knew it," she thought. "I knew she wasn't worthy of him." From that day forward, the image haunted her. Every time Andrew mentioned his wife's long shifts, Margaret imagined secret rendezvous in break rooms and quiet corners of the hospital. Every laugh, every touch she had witnessed replayed in her mind until suspicion hardened into certainty. Unable to contain herself, Margaret confronted Andrew one evening. He had come by alone, hoping for a quiet dinner with his mother, but she launched into it the moment the plates were set. "Andrew, I saw her," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "At the hospital, with another man." A doctor. They were laughing, touching. Don't tell me you haven't noticed. She's betraying you. Andrew's fork clattered against his plate. His expression shifted from confusion to shock, then to anger. Mom, stop, he snapped. You're imagining things. Emily would never do that. I know what I saw, Margaret insisted. You think she's devoted, but she's using you, humiliating you behind your back. Andrew pushed his chair back, his jaw tight. You've never liked her. You've been waiting for something to confirm your bias, and now you're twisting nothing into something ugly. Emily is my wife. She's loyal, she's good, and she loves me. You're the one who can't accept her. Margaret's chest constricted as though he had struck her. For the first time, her son wasn't defending her, he was defending someone else. She tried again, her voice breaking. Andrew, I'm your mother. I've always protected you. Don't turn against me for her. But Andrew's face was resolute. If you keep this up, Mom, you're going to push me away. I won't let you ruin this. The words sliced through her. Margaret sat frozen as he stood, collected his coat, and left without finishing dinner. The door slammed behind him, and the house fell silent. That night, Margaret sat alone in her living room, the flicker of the lamp casting long shadows. Her thoughts spiraled between anger, fear, and grief. In her mind, she hadn't lost just an argument. She had lost her place in Andrew's life. Emily had won. To Margaret, it felt like theft. Her son, her purpose, the boy she had raised with every breath of her being, was no longer hers. He belonged to Emily now. And in Margaret's eyes, Emily had stolen him. Margaret Whittaker's 65th birthday was not just a celebration. It was a statement. She rented the grand ballroom of a well-known Houston steakhouse, a place with mahogany paneling, leather banquettes, and crystal chandeliers that gleamed like captured stars. The guest list was long. Former colleagues from her accounting firm, neighbors from her suburban street, fellow parishioners from her church. Each invitation was carefully considered, each RSVP marked on the neat list she kept in her notebook. She wanted the night to be perfect, a reminder to all who attended that Margaret Whittaker was a woman of accomplishment, grace, and standing. And most of all, she wanted Andrew there, her pride and proof of success. When Andrew arrived with Emily on his arm, the room seemed to brighten. He looked polished in his tailored suit, his posture confident. Emily, in a soft cream dress with her hair swept neatly back, looked radiant despite the plainness Margaret had always criticized. To the other guests, they looked every bit the happy young couple. They mingled easily, Andrew introducing Emily warmly, while Emily spoke with kindness and composure. Laughter rippled through the tables as people remarked how lucky Margaret was to have such a devoted son. Margaret accepted the compliments with a tight smile, but inside, tension coiled. Each time Emily leaned into Andrew, each time her hand brushed his, Margaret felt her control slipping. Dinner was served, glasses clinked, and toasts rang out. The evening unfolded with the kind of elegance Margaret had orchestrated. Then Andrew stood, raising his glass, and the room fell quiet. "There's something we want to share," he began, his voice carrying easily over the hum of conversation. He looked at Emily with a tenderness that made Margaret's chest ache. "We're expecting. Emily is pregnant. The baby is due in March." For a heartbeat, silence held the room. Then it burst open with cheers, applause, and laughter. Guests rose from their seats to hug the couple, to clap Andrew on the back, to congratulate Emily with genuine joy. Champagne was poured, glasses raised, and voices overlapped in celebration. But Margaret did not move. She sat frozen, her smile stiff, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. The cheers around her rang hollow, distant, like echoes from another world. Pregnant. Emily was pregnant. Instead of the joy she should have felt, Margaret's thoughts twisted in on themselves. That child isn't his. It can't be. She's been unfaithful, I saw it with my own eyes. And now she's passing off another man's baby as Andrew's. Her heart hammered, her breath shallow. All she could see was the image of Emily laughing with that doctor at the hospital, her hand on his arm. The laughter, the closeness, it had seared itself into Margaret's memory. And now, standing before her, Emily was glowing, clutching Andrew's hand, carrying a child Margaret could not believe was her son's. Her vision blurred as the room erupted in toasts. Someone tapped a glass, shouting, "To the Whittaker family's next generation." Laughter followed, applause echoing off the walls. The pressure inside Margaret snapped. She rose from her chair, her voice sharp, cutting through the celebration like shattered glass. "Are you even sure?" she said, her eyes locked on Andrew, her finger trembling as she pointed at Emily's belly. "That child is yours." The ballroom fell silent. Forks froze halfway to mouths, glasses halted midair. The clinking and chatter that had filled the room only seconds before dissolved into a suffocating hush. Andrew's face went pale, his smile collapsing into disbelief. Emily's eyes widened, her cheeks flushing crimson as though she had been slapped. For a moment, no one moved. Then the whispers began, small, horrified murmurs rippling across the tables. Emily's chair scraped against the floor as she stumbled back. Her hands pressed protectively against her stomach, her breath uneven. Tears welled as she turned and fled the room, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, the sound ringing louder than any applause had earlier. Andrew's chair toppled as he shot to his feet. He glared at his mother, fury blazing in his eyes. "How could you?" he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "How could you do this here, in front of everyone?" "Andrew," Margaret reached for him, but he stepped back, his jaw clenched, his face hard. "You've crossed a line," he said, each word deliberate, each syllable a wound. Without another glance, he turned and strode out of the ballroom, following his wife. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving Margaret alone in the wreckage she had created. Around her, the silence lingered, broken only by awkward coughs and the clinking of glasses hastily set down. Guests avoided her eyes, whispering among themselves, the sheen of the celebration tarnished beyond repair. Margaret stood motionless, her breath shallow, her chest heavy. What was meant to be her triumphant night had crumbled into humiliation. Instead of being remembered for grace and dignity, she would be remembered for the cruel question that had shattered the evening. And yet, even as shame burned her cheeks, a darker thought coiled in her mind. I only spoke the truth. I only said what no one else dared. One day Andrew will see I was right. The night of Margaret Whittaker's 65th birthday ended not with music and laughter, but with silence. In the days that followed, silence became her constant companion. Andrew did not call. When Margaret tried to reach him the next morning, her calls went directly to voicemail. By the second day, her text stopped showing as delivered. It wasn't long before she realized the truth. Her son had blocked her number. At first, Margaret refused to believe it. She dialed repeatedly, convinced that perhaps his phone had broken or the carrier had made some mistake. But when she called Andrew's office line, the receptionist politely informed her that he was unavailable. Days turned into weeks, and Margaret's hope withered. She had been cut off. The shame from that night clung to her. Neighbors who had attended the party avoided her eyes when she passed them at the grocery store. At church, conversations hushed when she entered the pew. The words she had spoken, "Are you even sure that child is yours?" still echoed in her mind, sharp as broken glass. And yet, even in her shame, Margaret clung to her conviction. She replayed the memory of Emily laughing with that doctor in the hospital lobby, the way she leaned in, the way her hand had brushed his sleeve. That image, burned into her thoughts, fed the bitter certainty that she had spoken out of truth, not malice. "One day," she whispered to herself as she sat alone in her living room, "Andrew will see it. He'll see I was right." Still, the loneliness gnawed at her. The house that once bustled with Andrew's visits now echoed with emptiness. Margaret found herself setting two places at the dinner table out of habit, only to clear one away before she sat down. She wandered through the halls, pausing at family photos, Andrew's graduation, his swimming medals, his first piano recital. She touched the glass of the frames, whispering apologies into the still air, though even then, she could not bring herself to admit she had been wrong. 2 months dragged by. The days blurred together, each one stitched with regret and bitterness. Margaret aged in those weeks, her reflection in the mirror showing deeper lines, her eyes clouded with exhaustion. Nights were the hardest. She would sit by the window watching headlights sweep past on the street outside, hoping, foolishly, that one of them might turn into her driveway. And then one late afternoon it happened. The sound of tires on gravel pulled her from her chair. She stood at the window, hardly daring to breathe, and saw Andrew's car parked in front of the house. For a moment, her heart soared. She rushed to the door, her hands trembling, and pulled it open before he could knock. Andrew stood there, framed by the fading sunlight. His face was calm, but there was no softness in his eyes. The boy who once clung to her hand at doctor's visits, the young man who had once sought her approval for every decision, was gone. Before her stood a man, firm, steady, and unyielding. "Andrew," she gasped, her voice breaking. "You're here." He nodded once, his jaw tight. "We need to talk." Margaret stepped aside quickly, ushering him into the house, as though she feared he might vanish again if she delayed. She hurried to pour him coffee, to offer him food, anything to make him stay. But Andrew refused both, remaining standing in the living room, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders squared. Margaret tried to fill the silence with apologies. "I didn't mean for that night to go the way it did. When you announced the baby, I panicked. I've been so worried about you, Andrew. I only want to protect you." Andrew's expression didn't change. "Protect me? You humiliated my wife in front of everyone we know. You humiliated me. Do you have any idea what that did to her? What it did to us?" Margaret's throat tightened. "I only asked a question. I saw her with another man. A doctor. They were too close. I couldn't stay silent." At that, Andrew's eyes hardened. "You don't know what you saw. You don't know her. You've built this story in your head, and it's poisoning everything." Margaret flinched, as though struck. For a moment, she wanted to argue, to insist that her instincts had never failed her. But the weight of Andrew's stare stopped her. He was no longer the boy she had raised. He was a man making his own choices, drawing his own boundaries. She reached for him, her hand trembling. "Andrew, please. I can change. I'll try. Just don't shut me out." Andrew stepped back, his distance deliberate. His voice was quiet but firm. "Mom, I came here to tell you something important, but you need to listen this time. Really listen." Margaret's breath caught in her chest. The living room seemed to shrink around her, the silence pressing heavy. She nodded slowly, her heart pounding, bracing herself for words she was no longer sure she wanted to hear. The living room was hushed, the ticking clock on the mantel the only sound between them. Margaret sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. Across from her, Andrew stood firm, his eyes leveled on her with a steady intensity that made her heart quiver. "You think you've been protecting me," he began, his voice measured. "But you don't know everything. You've built this idea of me, perfect student, perfect son. But that's not the full story." Margaret's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" Andrew drew in a slow breath. "In college, I nearly destroyed myself. I was drinking, using, running with people who didn't care if I lived or died. I was spiraling. You saw pieces of it, but you don't know how close I came to the end." Memories she had buried clawed their way back. Missing jewelry, late-night fights, his clenched fists trembling with rage. She swallowed hard, but before she could speak, Andrew pressed on. There was a night. I overdosed at a bus station. I stopped breathing. My so-called friends left me there, unconscious, because they didn't want to deal with the cops. I would have died if not for one person. Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears. Who? Andrew's gaze hardened. Emily. She was there. She saw me, called 911, and rode with me in the ambulance. She held my hand when I came to. She didn't know me then, just a stranger throwing his life away. But she saved me. Margaret stared at him, her mind struggling to catch up. Emily? The girl she had condemned, the one she had humiliated in front of all her friends. That Emily had been the reason her son was still alive. Andrew's voice grew more resolute. That night changed everything. I realized how far I'd fallen, how close I came to losing everything you'd worked for. Emily didn't judge me. She didn't walk away. She saw me at my lowest and chose to help. And later, when we crossed paths again, I knew she was the person I wanted in my life. She wasn't after money or status or some better life, Mom. She was my better life. Margaret's breath came shallow, her throat dry. Images tangled in her mind. Emily's modest dress at that first dinner. Her stories of sacrifice, the laughter in the hospital lobby. Margaret had twisted them into signs of betrayal. And now, hearing the truth, she felt the weight of every cruel thought, every cutting remark, every suspicion she had hurled at the woman who had saved her son. I didn't know, Margaret whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't know, Andrew cut in sharply. You didn't want to know. You never asked. You decided who she was the moment you saw her shoes, her dress, her background. You let your pride blind you. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. She reached out a trembling hand, but Andrew didn't move closer. You've spent months accusing her, humiliating her, driving a wedge between us. And after what you did at your birthday party, his voice faltered, anger flaring before settling into sorrow. You broke something, Mom. You humiliated the woman who gave me a second chance at life. How do I forgive that? Margaret shook her head, her sobs breaking free. I thought I was protecting you. I thought you thought wrong, Andrew said firmly. His shoulders squared, his voice unwavering. Emily is my wife. She's carrying my child. If you can't accept that, if you can't accept her, then you're choosing your pride over me. And I won't let you destroy this family before it even begins. The words struck like a final verdict. Margaret felt them pierce deeper than any insult, deeper than Tyler's betrayal years ago, deeper even than Richard's death. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just losing influence over her son. She was losing him altogether. Her tears blurred the room into haze. Andrew, please don't make me choose between you and... Andrew's jaw clenched. I'm not making you choose. You already have. But now I'm telling you the consequences. If you want to be part of my life, if you want to know your grandchild, you need to change. Because if you don't, I will walk away. I'll choose my wife and my child. And you'll be left with nothing but your pride. The silence that followed was crushing. Margaret's sobs softened into shallow breaths. She looked at her son, the man she had poured her life into, the man she had claimed as her reason for living, and saw a stranger drawing a boundary she could not cross. She nodded weakly, unable to form words. Andrew lingered for only a moment longer, his expression unreadable before turning toward the door. The sound of it closing behind him reverberated through the house like a final judgment. Margaret remained seated, her body trembling, her heart hollow. Shame and regret crashed over her in waves, but still, beneath it all, the remnants of pride whispered that she had only wanted the best. It was that pride, she realized, that had poisoned everything. She looked around the empty house, the photographs staring back at her from the walls. Andrew's smiling face through the years, frozen in time, untouchable now. The silence pressed in again, heavier than before. And in that silence, Margaret understood the truth at last. Her blind need to control, her obsession with appearances, her prejudice against a girl from Oklahoma had cost her more than she ever imagined. Her son's love, her son's trust, and perhaps, if she could not change, her son himself.